The courtroom buzzed with the low murmur of conversations, the clicking of pens, and the occasional shuffle of papers. Maya Johnson, dressed in a simple but elegant black suit, sat quietly in the front row, trying to keep her nerves in check. This was not how she'd imagined her day going. In fact, it wasn't how she imagined any of her days going, standing in front of a judge in a city courthouse, defending herself against a small fine that she knew was unjust. Maya had been late with the paperwork. Just one day, but the penalty had ballooned into something more, something she couldn't ignore. With her demanding job at the Department of Federal Employee Benefits and the constant stream of proposals she had been managing, something had slipped through the cracks. Now she found herself here, in front of a judge who didn't know her, didn't know the work she did, and didn't know the bigger picture. Judge Arnold Weston sat at the front of the room, his eyes hidden behind reading glasses, his brow furrowed in concentration as he flipped through the pages of her case file. His reputation as a strict, no-nonsense judge preceded him, and Maya could feel it. Every word he spoke was like a bullet aimed directly at her, delivered with a quiet authority that only added to her frustration. "You're here because of a late filing, Ms. Johnson," Judge Weston asked, his voice calm but stern, as though it were a question he already knew the answer to. Maya nodded, her palms sweating despite herself. "Yes, Your Honor. I apologize. It was an oversight, one I take full responsibility for, but I ask for your understanding. I'm managing a complex project that requires my attention. This mistake was purely administrative." The judge barely looked up from his paperwork as he made a note. "You know the rules. Filing deadlines are important for a reason. You're part of a system that relies on accuracy and punctuality. You're no different from anyone else. The fine stands." Maya held back the urge to lash out. She'd fought too hard to get to where she was, to be seen, to be heard, to let herself be defined by a momentary mistake. Yet the judge's words cut deep. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the sleepless nights spent crafting policies that would directly impact the lives of millions of federal employees. He didn't know how every aspect of her work had the potential to change the trajectory of government benefits, especially for those overlooked by the system. As Maya sat there, feeling the weight of his disapproval, something inside her stirred. Maybe he didn't know, but maybe it was time for him, and everyone in this room, to find out just who she was. Maya Johnson's story began far from the polished halls of government offices or high-stakes policy meetings. It started in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of a bustling city, where her mother worked long hours at a local diner, and her father, absent for much of her childhood, left her with a deep sense of determination to prove herself. As a child, Maya had a fire in her that no one seemed to understand. School wasn't easy. She was one of the only black students in her classes, and her teachers often underestimated her potential. But Maya refused to accept the labels others tried to place on her. She worked harder than anyone else, and soon the honors and awards followed. What she lacked in resources, she more than made up for in resilience. Her dream was never just to survive, but to create change. After earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, Maya pursued a degree in public policy, specializing in the inequities she saw in healthcare and employee benefits. While other students focused on climbing the corporate ladder, Maya's heart was set on giving a voice to those who had none. She was determined to challenge a system that ignored the needs of the everyday worker, the ones who were underpaid, overworked, and left behind. Her early career was full of challenges. As a young black woman in a predominantly white workforce, Maya had to prove herself at every turn. There were whispers behind her back, questions about whether she was qualified enough. But Maya never let it shake her. She moved through each position with precision and purpose, always keeping her eye on the bigger picture. Years passed, and Maya's work on employee benefits reform began to make waves. She started with small proposals, simple tweaks to outdated policies, but she quickly realized that the problems were much bigger than what any minor adjustments could solve. Federal workers, particularly those from marginalized communities, were struggling with convoluted benefit systems that didn't serve their needs. Healthcare was inadequate, retirement plans were confusing, and mental health support was virtually non-existent. Maya spent nights hunched over her computer, poring over data, drafting proposals, and speaking to experts in the field. Her work became a quiet obsession, a mission to design a system that would not only make federal benefits more accessible, but also create a fairer and more equitable structure for workers across the country. What Maya was building wasn't just a set of reforms, it was a movement. Yet to the world, she was still just another faceless bureaucrat. Her innovations were buried in memos and long policy briefs, unnoticed by the public. And so, as she sat in the courtroom that day, facing a judge who couldn't see the depth of her work, Maya felt the weight of years of invisible labor. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to be defined by this moment. Not by the judge. Not by anyone. Her journey, she knew, had only just begun. As Maya sat there in the courtroom, her thoughts were far from the proceedings in front of her. While Judge Weston dismissed her case with mechanical indifference, her mind raced through the countless hours spent researching, drafting, and refining the policies that would one day reshape federal employee benefits. What few knew was that Maya's work had the potential to affect millions of lives in ways most people couldn't even begin to imagine. She'd started small, as many reformers did. A modest proposal here, a slight adjustment there, all aimed at improving the accessibility and efficiency of federal healthcare and retirement systems. But soon, Maya's vision expanded beyond mere tweaks. She began to see a bigger picture, a system that could transform the lives of federal workers, particularly those from underserved communities who had long been overlooked. Federal employees were the backbone of the government, yet they were often subjected to a maze of complex benefits that few truly understood. There were workers who had no access to proper health care, others who faced confusing retirement plans, and far too many who had no mental health support, leaving them to struggle in silence. Maya knew this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death for some. Determined to change the status quo, she dove into her work. She gathered data, consulted with experts, and mapped out a framework for a more inclusive benefits program. One that didn't just offer cookie-cutter solutions but understood the unique needs of every individual, regardless of race, gender, or background. She envisioned a world where federal employees could not only access the benefits they deserved, but could thrive with the tools necessary to care for themselves and their families. Maya's plan wasn't without challenges. There were stakeholders who resisted change, seeing her reforms as unnecessary or overly ambitious. But Maya had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She pushed forward, slowly but surely, earning the trust of lawmakers and influential figures in government. Her ideas started gaining traction, with a growing coalition of allies rallying behind her. But despite the growing attention, Maya's efforts remained largely out of the public eye. She wasn't a politician or a celebrity. She wasn't the face of a movement. She was just a consultant, quietly working behind the scenes to create something that could leave a lasting impact. As the judge dismissed her case and continued to page through paperwork, Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of her work. The world around her had no idea how close it was to a revolution not fought with headlines or protest signs, but through policies that could uplift an entire workforce. The courthouse, for all its formality, felt like an isolated bubble. But out there, in the broader world, Maya's vision was slowly taking root. She was already making history, even if no one knew it yet. This courtroom moment, this small, almost trivial fine, felt like an unwelcome distraction. Maya's true battle was yet to come. The courtroom settled into a tense silence, punctuated only by the scratch of Judge Weston's pen against paper. He didn't seem to notice the quiet frustration building within Maya. She was still processing his dismissive tone, his refusal to acknowledge the larger context of her work. She had expected a fair hearing, but the judge's cold demeanor made it clear that this was nothing more than a procedural matter to him. A simple case, no more significant than any other fine he'd handed down in his career. "Ms. Johnson," the judge began, finally looking up from his notes, "I've heard your argument, but your oversight in this case is clear. We all have responsibilities, and when deadlines are missed, consequences follow. The fine stands." Court adjourned. Maya blinked, stunned by the finality in his voice. Was that it? Just like that, after all the effort she'd poured into her work, after all the people she'd helped, and the systemic change she was driving, this was how she was seen. Just another rule breaker to be dealt with and dismissed. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had learned long ago to bite back her emotions, especially when they threatened to cloud her judgment. As she stood to leave, she caught the briefest glimpse of the judge's face, a look of irritation, as though her case were just another small nuisance in his otherwise straightforward day. It stung, but it also lit a fire inside her. Maya had spent years proving herself in spaces where she was the underdog, always underestimated by those who hadn't taken the time to see her for who she truly was. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Walking out of the courtroom, Maya knew one thing. She wouldn't allow herself to be invisible any longer. She had worked tirelessly to develop a benefit system that would change the lives of millions. People who were working in the background, sacrificing so much just to keep the gears of the government turning, deserved better than this. They deserved better than being overlooked by a system that didn't care. Maya pulled her phone from her purse and began scrolling through messages, emails, and updates on her latest project, an initiative to overhaul the federal employee benefits program. She had been quietly advocating for reform, but as she read through the feedback from colleagues and politicians who had supported her ideas, a wave of determination washed over her. If Judge Weston couldn't see her for the trailblazer she was, she would make sure the rest of the world did. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And in the days ahead, Maya was going to make sure that her voice, and the voices of millions of federal employees, were heard louder than ever before. The next few days were a whirlwind for Judge Arnold Weston. What had initially been just another routine case now felt like a lingering shadow that he couldn't shake off. His assistant, Emily, had brought up something in passing that he hadn't given much thought to during the hearing. As she handed him the next stack of files, she casually mentioned, "You know, Maya Johnson. She's been getting a lot of attention lately. There's a piece about her in the national news." Judge Weston hadn't been interested in following the media lately, but Emily's words piqued his curiosity. "What about her?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. Emily flipped through a few papers and found an article about Maya's recent work. She handed the article to the judge, who reluctantly began reading. As he skimmed the paragraphs, the weight of what he was reading hit him. Maya Johnson wasn't just a consultant. She was the lead architect of a revolutionary project within the Federal Employee Benefits Program, a program that, according to the article, would impact millions of government workers across the country. The more he read, the more he realized that this wasn't just a trivial mistake. Maya had been designing a groundbreaking benefits system aimed at providing better health care, retirement, and mental health support for federal employees. Her work was already garnering attention in the highest echelons of government, and a coalition of lawmakers had begun championing her reforms. Maya wasn't just any government worker. She was a visionary, and her project had the potential to change the lives of millions of Americans. Judge Weston stared at the article in disbelief. The woman he had dismissed so easily in court was at the forefront of one of the most important movements in the federal system. It wasn't just her work that caught his attention. It was the underlying purpose of her project. The benefit system she was designing wasn't just about improving policies. It was about creating a fairer, more equitable world for people who had long been overlooked. His mind raced as he processed this new information. How had he not known? How had he been so quick to make a snap judgment, to treat Maya like just another faceless bureaucrat? He had spent decades in his role, handing down judgments, yet here was someone whose work could actually transform the lives of those affected by the very system he'd spent his career upholding. Judge Weston couldn't shake the sense of shame that settled over him. He had misjudged Maya in the worst possible way, dismissing her not just as a person, but as a force for change. The fine, the courtroom, none of it seemed to matter anymore. What mattered was that Maya's work was much bigger than any small mistake. It was a movement in progress, and he had unwittingly stood in her way. Determined to make things right, Judge Weston knew he had to reach out to Maya. But how? The following morning, Judge Arnold Weston sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen with a sense of unease. The article about Maya Johnson had unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As a judge, he was used to being in control. Decisions were his to make, and outcomes were clear. But with Maya, everything had shifted. He'd made a snap judgment, one that he now deeply regretted. He knew he had to do something about it. The judge's role was one of authority, but also of fairness. He couldn't let his mistake define how Maya would be seen by the legal system, or the world, for that matter. Maya wasn't just another federal worker. She was at the forefront of a movement, and he had been blind to it. After some deliberation, Judge Weston decided he would reach out to Maya. He needed to apologize, not just for his dismissal of her in court, but for failing to see the bigger picture. But what was the right approach? An email would seem impersonal, and a phone call might feel too formal. No, this required more. It required a face-to-face apology, one that acknowledged his failure and made room for a meaningful conversation. That afternoon, Judge Weston had his assistant contact Maya, requesting a meeting. He was nervous, unsure of what her response would be. He had no idea how Maya would react, but he knew it was the only way forward. To his surprise, Maya agreed to meet with him the following day. When Maya entered his office the next afternoon, Judge Weston stood up from his desk, his usual formality replaced by an uncharacteristic unease. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Maya, thank you for meeting with me," he said, his voice sincere but carrying a trace of apprehension. "I want to start by offering a genuine apology. I made a serious mistake in my judgment of you, one that I deeply regret." Maya took a seat, her expression unreadable. She had expected this apology for days, but now that it was finally happening, she didn't quite know how to process it. She had braced herself for a formality, for a dismissive gesture that might make her feel more patronized than validated. But the sincerity in the judge's voice gave her pause. She had seen people in positions of power apologize before, but never with this level of humility. "I misjudged you, Maya," Judge Weston continued, his tone softer now. "I failed to see the incredible work you're doing. And for that, I'm truly sorry. I want you to know that I am committed to supporting you moving forward in any way I can." Maya studied him for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just a routine apology. It was a genuine acknowledgement of her worth and her impact. "Thank you, Judge Weston," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "It means more than you know. But more than that, I hope we can work together to make sure the changes we're both striving for, change that will affect millions, actually happen." The judge nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. I believe in what you're doing. Let's make sure we do it right." In the weeks that followed, the news of Judge Weston's apology spread like wildfire. The initial shock of the apology, issued publicly and personally, rippled through both the legal world and the political landscape. It wasn't every day that a judge acknowledged his own failure in such a transparent and meaningful way. Maya's supporters, many of whom had worked alongside her for years, were impressed by the gesture, but more importantly, it brought attention to her mission in ways they hadn't expected. Maya herself was taken aback by the sudden media attention. She had worked in the shadows for so long, quietly pushing her vision forward. And now, seemingly overnight, her work was no longer invisible. Articles, interviews, and news reports about her project on federal employee benefits began popping up everywhere. Even larger outlets picked up the story, framing her as a trailblazer in the realm of public policy reform. The more people learned about her, the more they realized that Maya wasn't just challenging an outdated system, she was redesigning it from the ground up. For Judge Weston, the exposure was both a relief and a challenge. As the story spread, many people began to look at him not just as a judge, but as someone who had learned from his mistake and was actively trying to make amends. His involvement with Maya's work became a key talking point. The once distant figure, who had only seen her as another government worker, was now publicly championing her cause. The apology, it seemed, had not only mended fences, but had also connected two unlikely allies in a larger push for reform. Maya, however, was determined not to let the media buzz distract her. She knew the real work was still ahead of her. The momentum was growing, but there was still a long road to travel before any real policy changes could take place. As she continued her work, she kept her focus on the goal: to build a benefit system that was truly equitable and accessible. She worked tirelessly with her team, fine-tuning her proposal, getting feedback from experts, and meeting with lawmakers who were beginning to take her seriously. But more than that, Maya realized that the shift in her relationship with Judge Weston was an opportunity to bridge gaps. They began collaborating in earnest, meeting to discuss how to ensure that her reforms would not only be politically viable, but also legally sound. It was a unique partnership, one built on a shared understanding that change wouldn't come from the sidelines, but from engaging directly with those in power. The ripple effect didn't stop with the two of them, though. As more and more government employees rallied behind Maya's reforms, it became clear that a movement was brewing. It wasn't just a few policy changes. It was a full-scale transformation of how the system viewed and supported its workers. People across the country, inspired by Maya's vision and Judge Weston's public apology, began to demand better for themselves and their families. The work of one determined woman had ignited a fire, and the flames were spreading. Months passed, and Maya's influence continued to grow. What started as a single initiative to reform federal employee benefits had blossomed into a full-scale movement for social justice and workplace equity. She had become the face of a new kind of leadership, one that didn't rely on traditional forms of power, but instead on empathy, knowledge, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Her work had caught the attention of not just politicians, but everyday workers, who began to see Maya as a champion of their rights. Maya's relationship with Judge Weston had evolved as well. What began as a formal apology had turned into a genuine collaboration, one that stretched beyond the courtroom and into the corridors of government power. Weston, once seen as a conservative figure, now found himself advocating for changes that he had never considered before. His judicial experience, combined with Maya's grassroots understanding of the system's flaws, made them a formidable team. Together, they worked to bridge the gap between legal reforms and practical solutions, ensuring that the changes Maya had envisioned would be both just and implementable. By now, the proposal Maya had worked on for so long was beginning to take shape as actual policy. She had secured backing from key lawmakers who had long been resistant to overhauling the system. Slowly but surely, the idea that had once been dismissed as too ambitious or impractical was gaining traction. Maya's reforms would bring comprehensive health care, clearer retirement benefits, and expanded mental health resources to millions of federal employees. It was a victory not just for those who worked in government, but for the principle that public servants deserved the same dignity and respect as anyone else. In a historic moment, the bill was introduced on the floor of Congress. Maya was there, sitting in the audience, watching as the lawmakers who had once questioned her work now stood in solidarity. The room was filled with a sense of cautious optimism, a belief that, just maybe, things could truly be different. Judge Weston was there too. He stood on the sidelines, a quiet observer to the wave of change that had been set in motion. Maya had invited him to the event, acknowledging that his support had played a pivotal role in her success. They exchanged a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come since their first meeting in the courtroom. For Maya, this wasn't just the culmination of years of hard work, it was the beginning of something much larger. As the bill gained momentum, she began to speak at public events, inspiring others to take up the mantle of change in their own communities. The revolution she had started, not with protests or headlines, but with policies that could tangibly improve people's lives, had begun to spread beyond the federal government. Maida's story became one of transformation, not only of a flawed system, but of a woman who had been underestimated and dismissed, yet who had changed the course of history. She had shown that sometimes the most significant revolutions begin in the quietest of places, driven by a single person who refuses to accept the status quo. And for Maya Johnson, the journey was just beginning.